What if I told you there's a horror game so psychologically disturbing that people genuinely believed it was banned from the internet? Not because of gore or jump scares, but because it forces you to confront something far more terrifying than any monster could ever be. This is the story of Mouthwashing, a game that arrived quietly in September 2024 and somehow managed to spark one of the most bizarre controversies in indie gaming history. We're talking about fake bans, viral misinformation, payment processor drama, and a community so divided that they can't even agree whether this game should exist at all. Today, we're diving deep into the mouthwashing iceberg, from the surface level details that caught everyone's attention, all the way down to the ethical questions that still keep developers awake at night. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why this lo-fi space horror became the game that everyone was talking about, even when they couldn't find it. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever played a game that made you genuinely uncomfortable? Not scared, not startled, but deeply, profoundly uncomfortable in a way that stuck with you for days. Keep that feeling in mind, because we're about to explore what happens when a game pushes those boundaries so far that reality and fiction start to blur. Let's start with what you'd find if you just casually stumbled across Mouthwashing on Steam. Released by Wrong Organ and published by Critical Reflex in September 2024, it markets itself as a psychological horror experience with that distinctive PS1 era aesthetic that's become so popular in indie horror circles. The setup seems straightforward enough. You're aboard the Tulpar, a commercial freighter that's become stranded in space after some kind of catastrophic crash. The ship is bathed in this relentless, oppressive orange light from a nearby sun, creating this claustrophobic atmosphere where day and night don't exist anymore. Your captain, Curly, is severely injured and sedated, leaving the remaining crew to figure out how to survive with dwindling supplies. The ship's cargo? Thousands of bottles of mouthwash. Yeah, mouthwash. At first glance, it seems almost absurdly mundane for a horror setting. The game presents itself through a fractured narrative structure. You're jumping between different time periods, experiencing events out of order, and the reliability of what you're seeing is constantly called into question. Hallways that should lead one way suddenly twist in another direction. Rooms appear slightly different each time you enter them. Audio cuts in and out with distorted breathing and muffled voices. Within weeks of release, Mouthwashing had earned overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam. The Guardian described the dread as something that lingers long after the credits roll. Players were calling it haunting, suffocating, and unlike anything they'd experienced in horror gaming. But here's where things get interesting. Even at this surface level, something felt different about the community response. This wasn't your typical indie horror game where people shared funny reaction clips or talked about their favorite jump scares. The conversations were darker, more personal, more careful. Once you dig past the initial marketing and reviews, you start to understand why Mouthwashing hit differently than other horror games. The content warnings on Steam are extensive. Extreme violence, gore, mutilation, and worse. But players quickly realized that the "and worse" was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that description. The horror in Mouthwashing doesn't come from monsters or supernatural elements. It comes from people. Specifically, it comes from the very human capacity for denial, manipulation, and the systems we build to avoid facing uncomfortable truths. That cargo of mouthwash starts to reveal itself as something much more sinister than random product placement. It becomes a metaphor for sanitization, for covering up bad tastes, for rinsing away evidence and pretending everything is clean. The game doesn't just tell you this symbolism exists, it forces you to participate in it through the gameplay mechanics themselves. players began sharing their experiences online, and the responses were unlike anything I'd seen in gaming communities before. Trauma survivors wrote detailed Steam reviews explaining how the game was nearly impossible for them to complete, not because of explicit content, but because of how accurately it portrayed patterns they recognized from their own lives. One review that gained hundreds of upvotes simply said, "This isn't fun. It's memorable. That's why it's brilliant." Another wrote, "I don't know if I can recommend it, but I'll never forget it." The dialogue in the game is fragmented and unreliable. Characters switch from appearing trustworthy to predatory within the same conversation. There's a pregnancy subplot that heavily implies non-consensual circumstances, handled through suggestion rather than explicit depiction. The game trusts its audience to understand what's happening without spelling it out, which somehow makes it more disturbing than if it had been graphic. This approach created a strange dual reaction in the community. Some praised the game for its brave approach to difficult subject matter, calling it essential art that used discomfort as a tool for important storytelling. Others criticized it for being unnecessarily heavy, questioning whether entertainment should ever venture into such dark territory. This is where our story takes a bizarre turn that perfectly illustrates how internet culture can transform a simple technical issue into viral mythology. In July 2025, itch.io announced they would be temporarily hiding adult-tagged games from search results while they reviewed their content policies. This decision came under pressure from payment processors like Visa and MasterCard, who are threatening to cut ties with platforms hosting adult content without stricter moderation systems. Around the same time, players started noticing that mouthwashing was no longer showing up in itch.io searches. The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore. Within hours, clips started appearing on TikTok claiming the game had been banned for being too disturbing. Reddit threads with titles like "They finally pulled it" started gathering hundreds of comments. A post on r/games declared, "According to Wrong Organ's composer, mouthwashing was caught in the NSFW sweep." Gaming journalists picked up the story. Headlines started appearing that heavily implied censorship. Psychological horror game disappears from itch.io during adult content crackdown. The narrative was perfect for social media. A brave indie game pushed boundaries so far that the system couldn't handle it. But here's the thing, none of it was true. itch.io later clarified that mouthwashing had actually been de-indexed back in October 2024, months before the adult content controversy. The reason was completely mundane. Wrong Organ had removed the playable files from their itch.io page and replaced them with a redirect link to Steam. According to itch.io's indexing rules, games need to have files actually hosted on the platform to appear in searches. No files meant no listing. It was that simple. Martin Holden, Wrong Organ's composer, initially repeated the banned for NSFW content explanation on social media before realizing his mistake and posting a correction with an apology. But you know how the internet works. The correction got a fraction of the attention that the original rumor received. The damage was done, and honestly, it might have been the best thing that could have happened to the game's visibility. The Streisand effect kicked in hard. Suddenly, mouthwashing wasn't just a disturbing indie horror game, it was the forbidden game that they didn't want you to play. People started sharing it like contraband. The story that stuck in everyone's mind wasn't the boring truth about file hosting policies. It was the much more compelling narrative about a game so psychologically dangerous that it had to be hidden from the public. Here's where we get into what actually makes mouthwashing brilliant and why that viral misconception felt so believable to people who had played it. The game doesn't just tell you a story about denial and systemic cover-ups, it forces you to participate in those systems through its core mechanics. Every gameplay element reinforces the central themes in ways that burrow under your skin. The most obvious example is how the ship's layout constantly shifts. Hallways that should go straight suddenly curve. Doors lead to rooms that weren't there before. Corridors loop back on themselves in geometrically impossible ways. The game explicitly tells you, your eyes are lying to you. This isn't a glitch or lazy level design. It's the thesis of the entire experience. Memory is unreliable. Perspective is distorted. The spaces we think we know can suddenly become unfamiliar and threatening. When we're in denial about something, our own perception becomes the enemy. The tasks you're asked to perform seem simple on the surface, but these mundane activities start to feel wrong in ways you can't quite articulate. You're going through the motions of maintaining order on a ship that's fundamentally broken, performing bureaucratic rituals that serve no real purpose except to avoid confronting the reality of the situation. It's like being stuck in a corporate job where everyone knows the company is failing, but you still have to attend the daily stand-up meetings and fill out your productivity reports. The repetition becomes a form of psychological torture, a way of maintaining the illusion of normalcy while everything falls apart around you. The fractured timeline adds another layer to this effect. One moment you're experiencing events from before the crash when the crew still had hope and trust in each other. The next moment you're weeks into the survival scenario, watching those same characters become desperate and dangerous. You never know which version of reality you're seeing, which mirrors how denial and trauma can make us lose track of our own narrative coherence. Critics picked up on this immediately. Games Radar called it constantly compelling, noting how the structure forces players to search for meaning even when clarity never arrives. The Guardian praised how the lo-fi aesthetic masks incredibly sophisticated psychological manipulation. The mouthwashing community became something special. Unlike typical horror game fandoms that focus on Easter eggs and jump scare compilations, these players turned into amateur psychologists and literary critics, dissecting every detail for deeper meaning. The most discussed theory centers around Jimmy, one of the surviving crew members. To many players, he represents textbook narcissistic behavior patterns. His dialogue is filled with deflection, manipulation, and self-victimization. He consistently positions himself as the hero of his own story while making choices that prioritize his comfort over everyone else's safety. But fans went deeper than character analysis. Some theorized that the entire ship functions as a metaphor for a fractured psyche. Each crew member represents a different aspect of consciousness, the injured captain as suppressed authority, the mechanic as practical problem solving, the intern as naive hope, and Jimmy as the ego that refuses to accept responsibility. Under this interpretation, the Tulpa itself becomes a therapy session turned inside out. The shifting corridors represent memories that change each time we revisit them. The mouthwash cargo symbolizes our attempts to clean away the bad taste of our actions. The crash that starts everything represents the moment when denial finally collides with reality. Reddit users created elaborate iceberg charts breaking down the game's symbolism into tiers of obscurity. Surface-level observations about looping corridors and unreliable narration gave way to detailed analyses of background props, ambient sound design, and the implications of seemingly throwaway dialogue lines. YouTube explainer videos started appearing that ran 2 or 3 hours long, treating the game like a complex piece of literature worthy of academic study. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own interpretations and experiences, creating a collaborative analysis that went far beyond anything the developers could have anticipated. One popular conclusion that emerged from these discussions was that mouthwashing doesn't actually contain a monster in any traditional sense. The horror comes entirely from human behavior and the systems we create to avoid accountability. As one top comment on r/horror gaming put it, the scariest part is realizing the game isn't fiction. It's about patterns we live with every day. By early 2025, something unusual was happening. Mouthwashing had sold over 500,000 copies, which is impressive for any indie game, but the cultural impact was extending far beyond typical gaming circles. Streamers discovered that the game's relatively short runtime made it perfect for single-session playthroughs, but unlike most horror games where streamers focus on entertaining their audience with dramatic reactions, mouthwashing streams became more like group therapy sessions. Chat would engage in serious discussions about trauma, workplace dynamics, and the psychology of denial. TikTok creators started making video essays about the game's themes, often using it as a jumping-off point to discuss real-world issues like corporate responsibility and victim-blaming culture. The game's lo-fi aesthetic made it easy to clip and share, but the conversations it sparked were anything but surface level. The gaming press took notice. Mouthwashing won Best Narrative and Player's Choice Awards at the Horror Game Awards. It received nominations at the Indie Game Awards and the New York Game Awards. Critics started describing it as a breakthrough that proved indie games could tackle subjects that major studios wouldn't dare approach. Wrong Organ gave interviews explaining their philosophy. They wanted to move beyond the walking simulator label that gets attached to narrative-focused indie games. Their goal was to use discomfort and taboo subjects as creative fuel, proving that games could be powerful tools for exploring difficult aspects of human psychology. The Steam reviews remained overwhelmingly positive, but they read differently than reviews for other games. Instead of talking about fun mechanics or replay value, players wrote about personal impact and lasting emotional effects. Many reviews admitted they couldn't recommend the game in traditional terms, but described it as unforgettable and important. One highly upvoted review captured the community sentiment perfectly. This game will ruin your day and improve your year. Play it when you're ready to think about some difficult things. At the deepest level of our iceberg, we encounter questions that the gaming community is still grappling with and honestly might never fully resolve. The central question is this: how should interactive media handle traumatic subject matter? Mouthwashing deals with themes of abuse, manipulation, and systemic cover-ups through suggestion and implication rather than explicit depiction. For some players, this restraint shows respect for survivors and proves that horror can be effective without exploitation. For others, the psychological impact of implication can cut deeper than any graphic imagery. The itch.io episode, even though it was based on a misunderstanding, revealed something important about how audiences perceive controversial art. The fact that so many people immediately believed the game had been censored suggests a widespread assumption that challenging content is always one step away from being banned. This creates a strange dynamic where controversial games gain credibility through the perception of oppression, whether that oppression actually exists or not. Mouthwashing benefited from the myth of its own censorship, which raises uncomfortable questions about how we market and consume difficult art. Payment processors like Visa and MasterCard have been increasingly aggressive about pressuring platforms to remove content they consider risky, even when that content is legal and arguably valuable. This creates a chilling effect where creators self-censor to avoid potential financial consequences, regardless of artistic merit. The mouthwashing community split into camps that still exist today. One side sees the game as essential art that uses discomfort as a tool for important social commentary. They argue that the most valuable art has always been challenging, and that sanitizing creative expression to avoid offense ultimately serves harmful systems. The other side questions whether entertainment should venture into territory that can genuinely harm vulnerable audiences. They point to the reviews from trauma survivors who found the game re-traumatizing and ask whether artistic freedom justifies potential psychological damage. Wrong Organ has been clear about their intentions. They describe their work as deliberate provocation designed to make players uncomfortable with silence and complicity. They want people to recognize the systems that enable harm and to feel viscerally disturbed by their own participation in those systems. Whether that goal justifies the means remains an open question. The game's impact on individual players varies wildly, from life-changing revelation to genuine psychological distress. Unlike other forms of media, games require active participation, which can make their psychological effects more intense and unpredictable. Understanding mouthwashing's impact requires looking at how intentionally crafted every disturbing element actually was. The development team drew inspiration from classic psychological horror films like Alien, Event Horizon, The Shining, and Pandorum, but they specifically wanted to avoid the supernatural elements that let audiences maintain emotional distance. The game's designer credited Puppet Combo for proving that retro-aesthetic horror could succeed without high-end graphics, but Wrong Organ pushed the lo-fi approach in a different direction. Instead of using the pixelated visuals for nostalgia or camp value, they used the limitation as a psychological tool. The unclear details force players to fill in gaps with their own imagination, which often produces more disturbing results than explicit imagery could achieve. A demo released during Steam Next Fest 2024 gained unexpected traction, leading to the full game's development. Console ports are planned for 2025, though the developers have expressed concerns about content ratings and platform restrictions potentially affecting the final experience. The team has been upfront about their goals. This wasn't meant to be a fun game in any traditional sense. They wanted to create something that would leave a lasting mark on players, something that would make them question systems they normally take for granted. They succeeded, but that success came with responsibilities they're still learning to navigate. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the mouthwashing phenomenon is how far the conversation spread beyond traditional gaming spaces. The themes resonated with people who normally never engage with horror content, leading to some unexpected community crossovers. In a Stardew Valley modding forum, someone jokingly suggested creating a mouthwashing crossover where Jimmy gets a happy ending on a farm, highlighting how the character had become a recognizable symbol of toxic behavior patterns even outside the original game's community. On itch.io discussion boards, developers started sharing their own concerns about content moderation and self-censorship. One post read, "They banned a game that had a moral focus, discussing consequences, not glorifying anything. I was too scared to update my game." Even though mouthwashing wasn't actually banned, the perceived threat affected how other creators approached sensitive subject matter. Academic discussions began appearing on forums typically focused on film studies and literature. Graduate students wrote thesis proposals analyzing the game's narrative structure. Psychology forums discussed whether interactive media could be used therapeutically or whether certain content should come with professional supervision. The game became a touchstone for conversations about art, censorship, corporate responsibility, and the ethics of entertainment. These discussions often had more lasting impact than the game itself, creating a cultural moment that extended far beyond its original medium. So here we are, at the bottom of the mouthwashing iceberg, and what have we found? A game that was never actually banned, built on a controversy that never actually happened, but somehow managed to spark genuine conversations about some of the most important issues facing creative expression today. The real horror of mouthwashing isn't in its twisted corridors or disturbing implications. It's in the recognition that the patterns it depicts, the systems of denial and complicity it forces us to participate in, exist all around us in the real world. The game holds up a mirror to behaviors we normally prefer not to examine, and that reflection is uncomfortable enough to make people believe it should be hidden away. Wrong Organ achieved something remarkable. They created a piece of interactive art that transcended its medium to become a cultural phenomenon. Whether that phenomenon is positive or negative depends entirely on your perspective, and that ambiguity might be the most disturbing thing of all. The toolbar carried mouthwash, but what it really carried was silence. The willingness to rinse away uncomfortable truths rather than face them directly. And maybe that's why the game felt so dangerous to so many people. Not because of what it shows us about fictional characters in an impossible situation, but because of what it reveals about the very real choices we make every day. In the end, mouthwashing didn't need to be banned to be controversial. It didn't need monsters to be horrifying. It just needed to be honest about human nature, and sometimes that's the most frightening thing of all. The conversation continues. The game exists in that strange space between art and provocation, between valuable discourse and potential harm, and maybe that's exactly where it belongs, in the uncomfortable middle, forcing us to keep talking, keep questioning, keep examining the systems we'd rather not think about. Because silence, as the game teaches us, has a way of spreading. And sometimes the only cure is to keep the conversation going, even when it makes us deeply, profoundly uncomfortable.